Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started. Hi, I'm Camille Rankine. I'm the co-chair of the Literary Council for the Brooklyn Book Festival. I want to thank you all so much. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming out today. You know, the weather had some plans for us, and we were like, we love books so much, we're coming out anyway. So thank you for joining us. And as a reward for your love of books and literature, we have two incredible writers here in conversation for you today. Jacqueline Woodson and Esmeralda Santiago, our Bobi Award winner. So I want to just tell you a little bit about these authors if you don't know already. Esmeralda Santiago is the author of 3 groundbreaking and critically acclaimed memoirs, When I Was a Puerto Rican, Almost a Woman, and The Turkish Lover. Her fiction includes novels America's Dream and the national best-selling historical novel Conquistadora. Esmeralda wrote the illustrated children's book Adolfo Navidades, and she's also the co-author of 2 treasured literary anthologies, Las Christmas and Las Mamis. Esmeralda's books have been translated into 12 languages. Jacqueline Woodson is the recipient of a 2020 MacArthur Fellowship, the 2020 Hans Christian Andersen Award, and the 2018 Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award. There's more. No. Just lots of things. She is also the author of the New York Times bestselling memoir, Brown Girl Dreaming, which won the National Book Award, as well as the Coretta Scott King Award, a Newbery Honor, and the NAACP Image Award. She also wrote the books Red at the Bone, a New York Times bestseller, and Another Brooklyn, a 2016 National Book Award finalist. She's also the author of numerous bestselling books for young readers. And I'm so thrilled to have both of these incredible writers here today. They're going to be in conversation with each other, which is such a treat and a special moment that cannot be replicated. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you to these incredible authors. I'm going to let them take it away.
Thank you. So do you tell the story, or do I tell the stories how we know each other?
Oh, yeah. I just want to start by saying congratulations. And I'm just so proud of you. I feel like I've known Esmeralda's work for many, many years, decades, even though we're not old. It's just amazing to see how prolific and thoughtful your work is and how it resonates with so many people. So you could start with the story of how we know each other.
So we have known each other since the early 90s.
Yes.
When I Was Puerto Rican was first published, in paperback, the publishers, Vintage decided that they wanted to have a teacher's guide to go in the back of the book. And so who wrote the teacher's guide? So this is how we know one another. And it was really, we were both kind of at the beginning of our careers, and it was just wonderful when I learned that she would be the person I'd be in conversation with today. I was very, very thrilled that it would be you, because we now go back a long way.
A long time. It's crazy. And I remember when I was asked to write it, I had fallen in love with the book. I feel like it was the first time I read a book, having grown up in Bushwick, which at the time was predominantly Black and Latino, and most of my family, that was my Bushwick, Madison Street family, had come from Bayamon, had come from Santurce, had come from San Juan, and
Puerto Ricans are here.
Yeah. And it was amazing to read a book and see the experiences of people I loved on the page, and having not known that those experiences, I hadn't read about them before. And so just that you had written this book, you became my superhero in this way of, and I just have such a respect for how from early you knew how important these stories were, and how important it was that all people were reading them. And that book is still very much in the world, and doing well, thankfully.
Yeah, no, thank you. I didn't know that anyone except for my family would ever read it, because I was a novice writer. I'd never even considered that I would be a book writer until I did it. And so I was I wrote it because I was a reader, and I had not found any kind of story like mine, and you feel so isolated when you're in a new culture and a new climate and new environment and everything, and you feel invisible in it. And I felt that very, very deeply, and felt like writing about it was my way of both kind of processing that experience, but also my awareness of how many millions of especially young people who are experiencing the same thing that I did, maybe in different decades and different cities, and they're coming from different countries.
Yeah.
But really, the experience is very similar. I didn't know that when I wrote that book. I just was writing my story, and then I realized, oh wow, I wish I'd known that people had the same experience, because I think I would have felt less alone at the time.
But then you wouldn't have written that book.
But then I wouldn't have written it if I had felt like, okay, I found it, I don't need to do it. So, yeah.
That's so wild, because, that saying, when there isn't a road, you have to make the road. And I think that's what we've been trying to do with literature. And because the stories are so specific, they speak to so many people. And talk about a book that's timely now in terms of looking at what's happening to people coming from other places, and the way they're trafficking bodies and displacing people. And you just think about the young people who can use, and I know that's not your story at all, but there are parts of us in that story. Here I am, a Black girl from Greenville, South Carolina, seeing myself in that book. And you wrote 3 memoirs,
Yes.
right? So I have 2 questions for you, and you could ask me questions if you want. But I want you to talk about the 2 other memoirs you wrote and your connection to Brooklyn.
Okay, well, the first memoir, really, I'd say about 2/3 of that book is about my experience in Puerto Rico and my expectations of that girl, of who I was and who I thought I was and what my life was going to be like, and so on. But when I started writing the book, really, I thought I'm going to write the book, the story of my life, until what happened yesterday, And so, of course, no, that's not. That would have been really, really boring. But also, I found myself with the first draft that was 600 pages, and I was still like 16.
Wow.
And I'm like, is my life that eventful?
That's hysterical.
I didn't know. I didn't know that there was so much to tell about that period. But of course, this is what forms us as our young experiences, and how do we deal with them, and how do you process them, and do we remain the same person, or do we, if we're going to be a different person, how do you create that person? So all these questions as I'm writing, and I just started writing stories, and then I realized, oh, there's kind of thematic thread around here about this kind of very courageous little girl who was terrified all the time, by the way, but I was brave about trying to deal with the circumstances. So that's when I began to understand why that story, why some of the stories didn't belong in this book. Somebody asked me earlier today, how do you choose? When you write a 600-page first draft, you very soon learn that you have to leave a lot of stuff out. And so every writer decides how to do that. And I decided to look at the themes in my life that still are part of my life. And so that's how I distilled all that stuff, which thank God it wasn't 600 pages, by the way. So, that then I began to understand the process, what I went through at that stage, because I hadn't thought about it that way. I was so busy being that I was not the person who said I want to be a writer when I grow up. I always said I want to be a reader.
Wow.
I just never thought of myself that way. And actually, the way I became a writer is that an editor, Merloyd Lawrence, she's the one who suggested that I write a memoir. And I'm like,
How did you
what?
meet her?
She actually read an essay that I wrote in the the alumni magazine. So she wrote to me and she says, you know, I usually get the alumni magazine and I go to the obituaries.
Oh, man.
But I never read the articles because they're all like, they're academic or whatever. She said, but the name, she's connected because we had met socially. I didn't know she was an editor, and I wasn't a writer. I was a filmmaker at the time. So she liked the essay, and she asked me to whether I had anything else like it. Well, yes, I did.
Wow.
So it was her idea that I write about my experiences, because she hadn't, you know, she's also a very wide-ranging reader, and she says, I've never read a story about a Puerto Rican girl coming to the United States. And so, you know, the marketing things, I was not, for her it was a marketing decision in addition to the fact that she liked the writing. And for me it was like, I'm too young to write about my life.
Huh.
It's like, nothing has happened, you know. So she says, well, just start with the first thing you remember. And so, yes, I started with feeling this hot wall when I was 4 years old and burning my hand. And so then from there on, it was like, it just flowed as a story that I guess I had been writing without realizing. And then same thing happened with the other memoirs. You know, the first draft of When I Was Puerto Rican, I cut it in half because I realized nobody's going to read 600 pages of my life story. But also, it felt, once I read the whole thing and I started pulling out kind of the themes and the questions that I had, they really belonged in a separate volume from the questions that I had as a teenager learning English, trying to understand what it's supposed to, you know, I'm a Puerto Rican rural girl, all of a sudden I'm an urban teenager in the United States. So those kind of questions really belonged in a different narrative. And so that's how I make those decisions. But I really never intended that it would take me 3 books to get to the age of 27.
Wow, wow.
And I'm still wondering.
And did you, also the connection to Brooklyn?
Oh, and the connection to Brooklyn is we came here. So we came really literally from rural Puerto Rico to Brooklyn, really overnight. I have never forgotten, because it was an evening like we had today, stormy and rain and thunder and lightning, and it was dark because we arrived in the evening, and I had no conception of where I was going. I didn't know where I was going, and I knew we were going to New York, but I didn't have a sense of, you know, and I was angry at my mother because I didn't want to leave Puerto Rico. Who would want to? But I really didn't say, oh, goody, we're going to Brooklyn. You know, I had no idea what Brooklyn was in relation to any other place in the United States. I mean, it could have been next to LA as far as I knew. You know, I had no idea. So a lot of my, the first 7 years of my being in the United States was in Brooklyn, and we lived all over. People say, well, where did you live? We lived in Bed-Stuy, we lived in East New York, we lived in Bushwick, Williamsburg, you name a section, we were there, except Croton Heights. But but it was really, it was an education for me, because I had no, you know, you have no concept. Even, you know, when you're Puerto Rican, you look at a map. All of you do this sometime. Just imagine Puerto Rico. So I live in Puerto Rico, and it's a very big country to a 13-year-old girl, right? It's enormous. You know, you can walk down the barrio, and maybe you know most of the neighbors, but then you get to a certain point, you don't know anyone, right? You come to the United States, and you look at a map, and you're a dot on the map. It does not, Puerto Rico doesn't exist, except for like a little name right there, maybe, if they remember. So that conception of coming from a place that exists to being to a place that I'm supposed to accept as my home. Those 7 years in Brooklyn were very difficult for me, because I was resisting them all the way, just all the way. Because what I wanted to do was be where I knew who I was, where I knew my neighbors, where I knew the language, where I knew, yes, we have hurricane season, but you know, it's familiar. And so here, I resisted it for many, many years. And then when I left, I realized, wow, even in all that resistance, I learned language, I learned how to live in a city, I learned how to manage a subway system.
Our subway system at that, which is
I mean,
no joke.
It was amazing, but it took me a very long time to understand that as I was resisting it, it was actually feeding me. And so that's my connection to it. And then, of course, I had children. My children grow up. They leave home, and where do they come? They come to Brooklyn. So they live here for years. I'm like, how did that happen?
Oh man, it's so true. It's so funny because my family came here. I was younger than you were. I was 6 when we came from South Carolina, 6 or 7, and so I feel like, and my mom had spent her whole life in South Carolina. My grandmother had spent her whole life in South Carolina. And then they raise these kids, and we're city kids. And so there's that total geographic divide, aside from the generational divide. But we spoke a language they didn't understand even in our actions. And I think that's, and for me coming to Brooklyn, was different because I went home every summer to South Carolina, and to this day I say I'm going home when I go to South Carolina, even though I've been in Brooklyn all my life just about. But for you, you came at 13.
I was
right?
13, and and I wanted to go back to Puerto Rico. I was constantly complaining to my mother, why are we here? Because it was really hard. She had 11 kids.
Yeah.
She was constantly being laid off from work. We are constantly moving. Part of it is I was just wanted to be where it was familiar, right? Mm-hmm. So I was complaining all the way through my adolescence, I'm sure. Poor mother, she's still, worried about it and up in heaven. But it was very difficult for me to accept that I was here until I wasn't here anymore. Mm-hmm. And then, because then, 12 years after I arrived, I go to Puerto Rico. And so what do they tell me? You're not Puerto Rican. I'm like, what? It's like, you're asking, I'm going, why, And I had to explain myself why I was still, I was born here, I speak the language, all the things, why? And apparently, and I had not noticed, that I had changed by being in Brooklyn and being in the United States. It wasn't just the language, but my body language was different. The way that I spoke, the fact, I was much less a Puerto Rican woman. I was constantly told, usually by men, that I was not Puerto Rican enough somehow. Okay, who determines this percentage? Is it an average? So it was a constant back and forth and trying to make sense of that experience. Even as you live it, you're just still fighting it. Yeah. So it sounds like being able to go home for you, you were able to connect.
Oh, I just didn't belong anywhere.
Yeah.
It was home was home. Home was my grandparents and my relatives, all older. I didn't have a lot of cousins, but home, the kids there were like, what's wrong with the way you speak as a New Yorker? And so our family was, and we were also Jehovah's Witnesses, and there were all these ways in which we were outside. And then Brooklyn felt like that's where my people were, my ride or die friends, and that eventually, I guess both eventually became home, but I feel like so much of why I write is because I'm constantly searching for home.
Yeah.
So I think you can have a sense of home and not have home. Yeah. And I'm trying to recreate home on the page with every book I write.
But did you always want to be a writer since a little kid?
Since I was 7.
You did.
Yeah, I did, and I didn't have a backup plan, which I think is a good way to aspire to be a writer. Like, just have nothing else that you can do, so that you have to do it. Yeah. But I love telling stories. I loved hearing stories. I lied a lot. I just had this sense that story was everything. It entertained. It allowed you to escape. you know, it took you to places. I mean, it gave you language, which is interesting because you didn't start speaking English till 13,
Till I
right?
was 13 is when I first realized that I have to learn this language. You know, I'd never, you know, and I was part of it. You know, my mother came to the United States maybe a few months before, then went back to Puerto Rico, and then all of a sudden she's speaking a different language because she was surrounded by Puerto Ricans who had been here. So she would ask me to go to the store, you know, and she said, tráeme pan de slide. And I'm like, pan de slide? What the hell is that? I mean, I'd never heard of pan de slide. And it was, you know, sliced bread. But she was using like the vernacular that was spoken here, a lot of Spanglish that we could not understand in Bayamon. So all of a sudden, that's my first inkling that they speak a different language over there. And then, of course, coming here, you know, very quickly found out that I better learn this if I want to survive here, you know.
I hope we never lose Spanglish, though. You know, and I do fear that it's a language that is getting lost.
It's wonderful.
I was talking to Natalie Diaz, who is Native and Latinx. She's a poet, and she's been interviewing an elder who carries the songs of the Mojave people, and he died a week ago, the last of the elders to have these songs. And so she's been recording and trying to save the language. And I think about Spanglish. I mean, you know, tú necesitas un pamper. You know, it's like just the way that people talk that was about coming. It was a very particular time and a very particular language. And I feel like if we don't hold on to that, we lose that time and we lose that history. And that's heartbreaking because that's my life. You know, that's the childhood I knew and the life I knew, and so important to understanding so much about what it meant to come here from another place and belong here, right? You having a right to this country as a citizen, and then coming up against the wall of the language, coming up against the wall of, my mom had 4 kids, and I was a single mom, and trying to find a place to live in New York City as a single mom, and keeping in mind in the 70s, if you weren't married to a man, you couldn't get a credit card, you couldn't have a bank account, like, so just having to negotiate all of these different things that she had to negotiate, and by extension, we did, but adding to that the language, and I know my friend Maria, whose mom was also from Bayamon, and whose grandmother and uncles, they weren't allowed to speak Spanish in the house. I mean, she didn't speak Spanish in the house once she knew English. She's like, no, we're gonna speak English in the house. And Maria, for a long time, couldn't speak Spanish, and then rebelled and started speaking Spanish. And her grandmother was monolingual Spanish speaking. And it's so funny because I went to visit her grandmother, and I took my daughter, and she goes, ¿por qué ella no habla español? And I'm like, porque ella es una morena? Like, you know, and I said to Maria, you know, I asked her, when did her grandmother stop speaking English? She's like, she never spoke English. You spoke Spanish to her. And I had completely forgot that as a child. You know, once Maria started, you know, was insistent upon speaking Spanish to speak to her grandparents. But it was really interesting the way we had to negotiate language because of shame sometimes, and because our people wanted us to be solidly here.
Right. Yeah. Well, we actually, because there were 11 children, we actually took advantage of the fact that we were teaching each other English. And so we spoke English to each other because the parents didn't, you know, the adults around us had no idea, we thought, of course. But I mean, decades later, I learned that my mother knew a lot more than she let on.
Oh, wow.
But I mean, my sisters are here, right? Remember, we would be like, in English, right, to each other, and we thought,
thinking she didn't understand.
Yeah, you know, she understood more than we knew. But it was really, that was our way of having our space as children in this very crowded apartments, because we had the same situation. You know, a lot of kids a limited income for rent, and trying to find a place where 11 children and 2 adults can live. No, that was possible. We were very good at coming in at one at a time.
Yes,
You know, those
yes.
kinds of things. But I do remember, just all the things that we did with language to keep us together, the children together in a safe environment, at the same time that we are teaching one another the English that we didn't get in the United States. But I mean, I remember, my mother saying things like la furnitura, like la furnitura, la norsa, I mean, it was like, and it was really, it's like there were 3 languages in the house. There was Spanish, there was English, and then there was this hybrid.
Yes,
you know, that then we could all kind of meet.
Long live the hybrid.
Yeah.
I know there'll be time for the audience to ask questions, but did your family use the library?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I certainly practically lived in the library because it's the only place I was allowed to go to
Yes,
on
exactly.
my own.
Exactly.
So I had a very, within a couple of weeks of being in Brooklyn, and we were living in Bushwick, and the Bushwick Public Library was our branch, and it was only about 2 blocks from our house. So once my mom understood I was going to the library, because then I would come back with stacks of books, so she knew that's what I was doing. Remember, teenage girl. So, and I would do my hair, stuff like that. Because of course you do. I mean, I had to look nice for the librarians.
Oh my goodness, that's hysterical.
So, but I would come back, and so I practically lived there. And also, for the public library, and for me, and I think probably for my sibling, sometimes we lived in apartments that had no heat in the winter. And where's the safe places that we could be comfortable? There would be our schools that would usually be heated, and the public library, and a hospital, which we didn't want to go to.
Yes.
So these are the 2 places where we could be comfortable during the winter, and then we'd come to these very cold apartments, not because we could, the landlord just didn't send up the heat. No me han dado el steam. ¿Cuándo viene el steam? I'm like, I don't know cuándo viene el steam, but that was another place for us to feel, not only, warm, but also it's a safe place for you. Not like the bad guys don't go to the library.
Yeah, it's so true.
Maybe they're between your house, but they don't
On
go
the
there.
way,
Yeah, they don't go there.
Yeah, they don't follow you inside. It's true, we went after school because my mother worked, and it was basically our after-school center.
Yeah.
So we had to go to, and the library knew it. She knew that she was babysitting, and we
Yeah.
knew we had to behave there.
Yeah.
And then at 5:45, my mother picked us up, and so we had to have active library cards, and if we had books overdue, it came out of our allowance. Like there was a whole system around the library.
Yeah.
Were you surprised by how much attention your writing got and continues to get?
I'm shocked. I was shocked. I mean, I remember I write this book, and then, you think about those of you who have gone through the experience of being a writer, you write a book, and then you think, okay, it appears in a bookstore, right? Somehow there's magic. But there's this whole process that I did not know about, which was like marketing and publicity and all that kind of thing. Book covers. I mean, there's all sorts of things that all of a sudden you have to do that you didn't think you had to do. So I remember I was invited by my publishers to meet their marketing team. Who knew there's such a thing, right? So I meet the marketing team, and they say, we're going to be selling your book, et cetera. I said, well, no problem. You're going to sell 10 of them. Because I have 10 siblings, and they're all adults, and they all have jobs. So you're going to get sell 10. So that was really my expectation, is that I said, I remember somebody saying to me, who cares about Puerto Ricans? They said to me, right? Wow. Right? And so I had lived with that for years, that accepting it in a way, but at the same time fighting that, right? Because maybe that person didn't care, but I cared. And so I'm facing this room of, pardon me, white people, mostly men, who are telling me they're going to sell my book. And I said, there's no chance in hell they're going to sell this book anywhere to anybody. I mean, they are not they wouldn't go into the neighborhoods of the
Yeah.
people who need this book. So I had very, very low expectations. And so when it actually began to get a lot of attention, I was just as shocked as anyone.
Your writing's so beautiful. Can you talk a little bit about Conquistadora, which is, was that your last novel?
That was my most recent, not the last one.
No, yeah, most recent, most
The older
recent.
you get, you never say the word last. So yes, it was my most recent, and so I have a book coming next year, actually.
Oh, wow.
A novel. And that book came out of, it came from this desire to know more about Puerto Rican history, because of course I left at 13, and so my education in Puerto Rico ends there. And in the United States, we don't exist, I thought. So I said, so I have to learn about my own history, because now I also have little, I want to make sure that they have a sense of it, and they have a lot of titis and tios and family and primos and primas, and they have to know about their culture. So I began to read a lot about Puerto Rican history, and the more I read it, all the books that I'm reading are written by historians, and some of them were like, really, any historians here, please, take a course in novel writing. I mean, because they were not about human beings. It was about statistics, and it just didn't speak about us. And so the more
Were you reading in English or Spanish?
I'm both, in both. And I'm very fortunate that I'm able to read in both languages. So the more I read it, the more I realized, wow, we, the poor people of Puerto Rico, of which I come, we are not in these histories. It's, there's all these soldiers going around, and then there's all these, politicians, but nobody's talking about the Jibaros, and so I think Conquistadora comes from my desire to bring Puerto Rican history to people who think we have no history, including Puerto Ricans. I was stunned. I would talk to some Puerto Ricans, and I would say, when was the decree that freed the enslaved people? Many of them could not tell me. They couldn't tell me. They didn't know the dates. And so I go, if we don't know, they need to know. We need to know. History is it's going so quickly, and Puerto Rico has changed so fast, even in my generation, and we can't lose that history. And so Conquistadora was the beginning for me of telling a series of books about the history of Puerto Rico, but from the perspective of the people who lived it. And the other thing we have to know, that history doesn't happen. Well, history happens to us, but really we make it happen. It doesn't just, it's not like, somebody make the rules and you have to do this now. We create it, and I was really curious about who created our history. And so that's where that emerges, and I'm on book 4 of that series, actually, because I can't stop writing about it and about our lives and the things that happened and didn't happen and should have happened.
Well, thank you for doing that. When's the next one coming out? Do you know?
August 8th, 2023.
Oh, wow. So, how did it feel when you heard you were being awarded the Bobi?
I was completely shocked. I was really, it had been a rough day, that particular day, when I received an email from Carolyn Greer asking me if I would accept an award. Yes, of course I would. But it was so nice. It was like, she was very, asking me. I'm going like, yeah. But it was very surprising and very moving to me, because, I don't live in Brooklyn anymore, and but somehow, Brooklyn is in me, obviously. And then of course, I knew that you had been a previous honoree. Other people whose work I have read and loved have also been honorees. And so I felt like, oh my God, that's like, I'm not worthy kind of thing. I really felt that to be recognized by this particular festival, which I adore, which is just so much fun especially when they have all the kiosks and all that. It was so cool. And so it was very moving for me, and I was very touched that they remembered me. I have not had a book since 2011, not because I don't have them written, things have happened. And so it was a great day for me at the end of the day. I read this, I feel like, oh my God, they have not forgotten me.
Has the ceremony happened already?
Yes, it was last night.
Oh,
Yeah. It was very lovely and very moving for me.
Yeah, and the award is nice.
And the award is awesome.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's so cool. I think what made me happiest was the bookmark.
Yeah.
Like, I want a bookmark. I tried to save some because, my kids are like, no, Mommy, I don't want that.
Yeah.
So,
They will want it.
I don't know. It's been 30 years, and I think of my 30-something books, I think they've read 2.
Oh my God.
Between the 2 of them.
Well, I have to tell you, my son is here, and I'm going to tell him, Anna, I hope you're not going to be embarrassed, but my son comes home, I think he was in 9th grade, first of the year, and he says, Mom, they're going to make us read your book. Well, thank you.
Yes. So maybe now you'll read it. It's so true.
I don't think he did. Did you, Lucas? Okay, sure.
I remember my daughter was on the school bus. She was going to the school, Mark Twain Way Out, and for some reason she had me in her phone as Jacqueline Woodson, and her friend had her phone, and I called, and she's like, Jacqueline Woodson's calling you. You know Jacqueline Woodson? I'm like, Toshi, you're really that down low about it? Like, nope. This has nothing to do with me. And it's funny because I think when I was younger, I thought one day I'm gonna have kids and they're gonna be like, oh, my mommy's a famous writer, and it did not happen. So, and
They're not impressed.
I think I kept writing because I had this idea that my kids were gonna be like, well, my mom's a writer and I hadn't written a book, and they'd be like, well, your mom wrote a book 20 years ago. She's not so right. So I'm like, let me keep writing until.
My God. All the pressure.
Yeah, it made zero difference. Like,
I think earlier today I was moderating a panel of debut authors, and one of the things that we talked about was, do not ask a writer what you're working on right now. What is your next book? Really, we know there's another book. We don't want the pressure.
especially when your book just came out.
Yeah, exactly. It's like when people get married, and you're at the wedding, and then they say, so when are you going to have babies? Well, none of your business.
You'll know when they're here.
Yes, it'll be on the shelf.
You'll know when we ask you to pre-order it. But it's an interesting, I would be interested in what the debut writers are thinking, because it's a brand new day in the world of literature, right? When we were coming up, we had publicists. No one was saying, well, can you throw this up on your socials? We had no socials. Publicists basically did the work of getting the book out. You went on a book tour, and now it seems for newer writers, there are all kinds of different pressures to getting the book out. And my hope is that writers just put their head down and write their books and not think about that.
I think so. I mean, I think you still ultimately you're writing the book for yourself at first, and then in your second draft, you worry about the reader. But the first draft is for you, and you can't be thinking about, what am I going to do on TikTok this time, about my book that I have not finished, because you don't have a book until you have a full draft, as we all professional writers know. It doesn't exist until you have it. And but somebody actually wrote to me and says, it would be really great if you would be on TikTok, and I'm like, I am an old lady. I'm not going to be doing like
fly on TikTok. You would kill TikTok.
What am I going to do on TikTok? I can't even imagine what to do there.
Oh man, I tried to do it. So my daughter, has this huge TikTok following, and she gets on, and she has this bandana around her chest, and she's like, people have been asking me about how I tie my scarf around my chest, so I'm gonna show you. I just take it and I do like this, and they have that TikTok voice. And so I got on, I made it, and she was young Dino at the time. So I made, and she had like thousands of followers, like hundreds of thousands of followers, and I was like, are these like old men following you, hoping you take that scarf off? Like, cause the channel looked a little soft porny to me anyway, so I made the Young Dino Mama TikTok, and I was like, I got a scarf, and I'm like, this is how you tie it. This is how I tie my scarf, and I do it like this, and I made a total like Aunt Jemima scarf thing. She was so mad, and I like tagged her.
See, I don't know about tagging either. I mean, what is tagging? Somebody will have to explain it to me. I know that you're supposed to do it, but
I know for us it's still a game, right? You're it. But yeah, I couldn't sustain the TikTok thing after that. I cracked myself up and then I was done. I was back to writing.
it's just like I'm saying, I am not that entertaining. I mean, I'm just not. I am a writer. I'm not an entertainer. I think, that car has passed many, many years ago. But it's really funny that is really just speaking to another generation of writers, is that you do have to become a performer as well as a writer, in addition to being a marketing genius with all the socials and all that stuff. And I think, in a way, I think we get a lot less support from our publishers because they expect us to have that. And my friend who's a publicist is going like this, but it's so challenging, I think, for a young person or an old person who's writing their first book to both write a book and then think of your audience out there that you don't know, who is dealing with a completely, all these other social media things that maybe you don't participate in, and you're expected to do that as well. And it's I think my job is to write. That is why there are people whose job it is to do that side of it, and know what tagging is and all the other stuff.
And also, I don't know about you, but I tend to be an introvert.
Yeah.
Like I like this table and this microphone behind, like being behind it, like a book, being behind a book, and that idea of having to sell oneself in this way is, I started a retreat for writers and composers and visual artists, and it's nonprofit, and I just learned about fundraising, and I'm like, wait, you mean I gotta go ask strangers for money? And I'm like, I grew up Jehovah's Witness. I did this already. I cannot do this again. like I will fund, I'll let MacArthur fund it. I'll let Astrid Lindgren fund it, but I do not want to ask folks for money. It's traumatizing, and I just, so for me, I feel like that too, that idea, even when publicists say, can you just put this, asset up about a reading you're doing or a book tour you're going on. And for me, I'm like, but the world's falling apart, and I'm going to stick my face into that mess on Twitter and Instagram and say, oh, by the way, I'm having a read. Like, there's something. Yeah. And so I'm always like, well, what disaster happened today? No, I'm not doing it today. What happened tomorrow? Like, maybe tomorrow when the world is a little quieter, but also the noise, breaking through the noise.
No, that's true. And I mean, you're just pointed out my dilemma. Like earlier this week, I have like all the tags or names for social media, but I don't contribute as much as I should. And so I did want to announce that we would be together here, and I really wanted to promote the festival because it is really wonderful. But then there's Fiona, hurricane in Puerto Rico, and then after things kind of calm down, and then and then Putin is invading the Ukraine, and then there's all this stuff, and so I kept putting it off, and I put it up like day before yesterday. It was still not a good day because then Ian was still whirling. But I said I have to give people some warning, But it's really hard to go through that and to reach out. I really love meeting my readers, actually. I'm not an introvert exactly, you can tell, but I am kind of a hermit. I really like being alone. And so to come out into an audience is both exhilarating and also scary and also very emotional, because I'm not used to it. And then when you're doing it in this kind of social media is so impersonal. They call themselves my friends, but I don't know them. None of them has taken me out for a drink or sent me flowers. I mean, they're not my friends. So it's so old. Even just the whole language around what we do has changed, and yeah, I sound like an old lady, don't I?
No, you sound like you're 100% in the
old days.
We didn't have to do that.
No, but it was something that it reminded me about our work. I think it's true that it is universal. You don't have to be African American from South Carolina, or you don't have to be Puerto Rican to enjoy the work that we are writing from our hearts. And one of the things that I remembered when I knew that more than my siblings would be reading when I was Puerto Rican, was when a dear friend of ours, Bobi Ann Mason, a Southern writer,
I love her
beloved,
work.
wonderful writer, wrote me by hand that she loved the book because she really identified with her experience when she came from Kentucky to go to graduate school in Hartford, Connecticut.
Wow.
And it has, she's never been to Puerto Rico, she doesn't speak Spanish, or thing. And then at that moment, when another writer understood that these kinds of stories are not just within this very small group of people, but really we're trying to reach out to a universal humanity by our very specific experiences and the stories that we come up with, because it's not everything our lives, by the way. So, because I think that's the other thing. I mean, people think that everything that we write happened to us. Has it all happened to you? Make half of it up.
I'm always like, well, I was never a teenage boy, cis boy, to my knowledge, but like, yeah, is that you in that book? It's like, no, I wasn't a white girl on the Upper West Side.
Right.
So, but yeah, people will assume it's you. But you're like her. It's like, no, actually I'm not. So, and I think people have a hard time figuring out where the people in our heads come from.
I think I have the experience that because when I was Puerto Rican, the character of Negi, the book ends when I'm about 14 years old. And so then they invited me to their school and whatever, and I show up.
Oh, God.
And it's like, really, I can see the disappointment. I mean, this is a woman decades from that experience, but it's really funny because with memoir, particularly, as you know, it's just like, you really only select certain things. You don't tell everything.
Oh, God, no.
Specific, but I think it's really funny, that people, you're like an amber in their minds. I am a 13-year-old girl to a lot of readers, and they don't think that I grew up.
Oh, man, it is so true. So I think we should take some questions from the audience. If anyone, look, who has what? Who was the first question? Oh.
What role did oral history and the stories that you heard at the table, in the kitchen, play in your writing?
That's for both of us, right? Yeah. So I don't know if everyone heard the question, but it was what did the role of oral history in the story?
I would say oral literature.
Oh, yes. Oral literature play in our storytelling, the stories we heard around the table, in our homes. For me, okay, that's redundant. When I'm talking, so I don't need to say for me. It makes me crazy. So here are the 3 things that make me crazy for me, when obviously it is. Nodding your head, because that's all you can nod, and shrugging shoulders. So because that's all you can shrug. So when I used to teach writing and kids would write shrug shoulders, I'm like, what else will you shrug? Delete. And I'm such a minimalist writer, so you don't need all those words. Why are you telling me her dress is purple? What does that have to do with the narrative? So when I was growing up, my mom and grandma, because I've been saying I wanted to be a writer since I was 7, when I would come into the living room or wherever they were talking, they'd shut up. Because they were like, you're going to go take our stories and, put our family. And I always, as I got older, I always thought, I should have just said, you're not that interesting. Like the characters living in my head are so much more interesting. But my family also, having migrated from the South, didn't talk a lot about the past, because they had PTSD. You know, my mom and grandmother grew up in the Jim Crow South, and that they did not talk about. They talked about the present South. And so it was hard. It wasn't until my grandmother was moving on to the next place that she started talking about her siblings, started talking about her life in Anderson, South Carolina. And at one point, when she was about 85, I went to visit her, and she's like, well, you know, I just want to tell you my siblings' names, because she had 11 siblings. And she started talking. She's like, go get something and write this down. And it was, for me, it was such a green light moment of like, now you can tell my story. Now you can start telling these stories. And so I think what I got from the family was language and cadence, you know, the lilt, the rhythm of my writing, even the white space for the silences when they didn't speak. That was all picked up around the table. And then I feel like a lot of my characters, my early characters, came from memories of my siblings and I jockeying around the table and just listening to the way people talk to each other, to sentence fragments, and watching bodies as they move, so I could figure out how to end a sentence and how to talk about how people moved. And then also just knowing that we come from a people who tell stories, you know, and that and that our stories are so powerful that we were for so long not allowed to learn to read and write because they knew the power of this story. And I think that kind of history gives me such a grace and a desire to hold on to every little aspect of that oral literature, oral legacy, or storytelling, because it's so important to our survival.
Yeah. I had the great fortune of having grown up without electricity.
Oh,
And
nice.
so the elders would just sit around with, you know, either torches or a quinquel, a lamp or whatever, to tell stories in the country.
Wow.
And so of course they didn't want the children to be there, pero yo era bien presenta. And so I would show up, even,
Always.
you know, or I'd be skulking in the dark, you know, listening to them telling their stories and telling jokes, naughty jokes, and all the kinds of stuff that they talked about, and a lot of gossip, of course. But then as I got older, my dad loved to record things, you know.
Wow.
So I said, Papi, can you tell me stories that, you know, he's living in Puerto Rico and I'm here, and so tell me stories on a cassette. And I would send him a cassette and cassette players. And he lived in a building for the elderly. They call them ejidas in Puerto Rico. And so I said, you know, so then he would send me just him telling me stories that he remembered. This is after I became a writer and I realized I'm going to need some stories. And they can't all be my story. So then I said, now that you've given me so many stories, can you talk to some of your neighbors?
Oh, wow.
And so he would send me, and so a lot of them were, you know, elders, some older than him who had experienced Puerto Rico at a time that no longer existed. And so I have all these cassettes, all these stories that from time to time I would listen to. And thank you, Sandra, for that
Yes,
thank question.
you.
I mean, it really helped me when I was writing Conquistadora, because I wanted the specific of how things were done. And so, like, one of the men that he interviewed, when I met him, he was like in his 90s, so this would have been in the 70s. So he was there when the Americans invaded Puerto Rico, you know? I mean, he had a memory of this, and it's in one of those cassettes. So I kind of had like firsthand stories that from people who just wanted to tell it because my dad asked them, but also because they needed to tell it because nobody had asked them. And so then after I said, you know, I should interview my parents. and so I have many, many hours of their stories that I used in my, you know, in just for the details more than anything. It's not their stories necessarily, but they will tell you things like, you know, when a machete gets, you might know this, Sandra, when you afilas mucho el machete, right? And you keep using it, and then it becomes like that short, se llama un mocho, ¿verdad? So I didn't know that it had a particular, a machete is born as a machete. And then as you cut it, it has different names. There's another name for the in-between.
And the smallest machete is the one that our enslaved ancestors used because the slavers didn't like our ancestors using the long machete.
Right, because it was too scary for them. So yeah, so then they said, and I remember that my father's mother used to have in her apron all the time a little mochito, it's like it was a little
That's
big handle.
so fabulous.
And so those kinds of things you cannot get unless you ask our elders.
yeah.
They have these stories, and one of the things that was so exciting for me is that they were willing to tell it, because they had to, and it was a gift.
It's such a gift, and that oral history is such a gift because, again, when you said Bobby M. Mason, I was thinking of people like Carson McCullers. I remember hearing on an album, a record album, when I was at McDowell, she was reading from Memoir of the Wedding, and that Southern lilt you don't hear anymore. Like, that's died out, and when you think of the language of your elders, just the way they spoke and the stories they had and the materials that they, like talking about the machete, those things not being in existence anymore. It's so important. Oh, I'm so glad you have those
I really
stories.
recommend all of you, if you have elders in your family, to really record them for yourselves, first of all, but also I think that now there are places that are collecting. I think the Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños right here in New York are collecting recordings of our elders, and they should go into the archives so that they don't disappear, because it is happening so quickly, and they're forgetting too. So it's very, very important, and it's a gift to you and it's a gift to them.
It's so true. I'm actually working on an elders project where I have writers like Natalie Diaz, Eve Ewing, Carolina de Rubertas, Denise Froman, Jenna Wortham, Caleb, like writers all over the country interviewing elders, getting stories from elders that we're going to collect at Insight at Columbia. And basically this theme is migration. It's about the story. And the next time I do it, I want to do immigration. I really want, because once they're gone, these stories are gone with them. It's so true.
But we are migrants. We are not immigrants.
I know you. I know.
I have to do it all the time.
I know Puerto Rico is part, and you are not an immigrant.
Not part of.
No.
We're an island.
Yeah.
But our, I think it's important. I think it is an important distinction, because a lot of sisters and brothers from Latin America who come here who are not U.S. citizens, even fewer rights than Puerto Rico.
question, why is it when I was Puerto Rican? And I constantly had to explain it. And then after a while, I didn't have to, because they'd read the book and they knew what it meant. So, thank you all so much for being here. Oh, it's so great. Thank you. We're going to have cannoli together up in summer.
That was awesome.
It was so much fun.